Empires don't usually announce their decline. There is no clear morning when people wake up and realize the world they trusted is already leaving them behind. Collapse rarely begins with sirens or speeches. It begins with something much quieter, a change in how people feel. Not dramatic fear, not public outrage, just a subtle internal adjustment, a small recalibration of expectations, a growing sense that promises no longer carry the same weight they once did. At first, it feels personal. A worker notices that effort doesn't translate into stability anymore. A family realizes that planning ahead has become harder than it used to be. A shopkeeper senses that customers are more cautious, more distracted, less confident. None of these moments feel historic. They feel ordinary, isolated, private. People tell themselves it's temporary. They assume conditions will normalize, that systems will correct, that leaders understand what's happening behind the scenes. Trust, after all, doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes gradually, through small disappointments that feel too minor to confront directly. Civilizations don't collapse because of numbers on ledgers. They collapse when belief quietly withdraws. Long before institutions fail, perception shifts. Long before currencies weaken, confidence does. Long before laws lose authority, people begin to interpret them differently. Rules start to feel negotiable. Agreements feel conditional. Truth feels flexible. And this shift almost always goes unnoticed while it's happening. Because from the inside, it doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like adaptation. People adjust their behavior. They become more cautious. They save a little more. They share less. They rely on close networks instead of distant systems. They stop expecting consistency and start preparing for surprises. These changes don't look revolutionary. They look practical. Every society teaches its citizens how to trust. They teach them to believe in contracts, in courts, in currency, in shared narratives. They teach them that institutions are stable and that tomorrow will resemble today. This invisible education begins early and runs deep. It becomes instinct. But once that instinct weakens, everything else follows. History shows this pattern again and again, not through dramatic turning points, but through prolonged periods of normalization. People normalize smaller portions, lower quality, delayed responses, broken promises. They normalize inefficiency. They normalize contradictions. They normalize explanations that no longer fully make sense. They normalize living inside systems that feel less solid than before. And because this normalization happens slowly, it rarely triggers resistance. It produces accommodation instead. Each adjustment feels reasonable in isolation. Each compromise seems manageable. No single moment feels worth confronting. By the time people realize something fundamental has shifted, they're already living inside the new reality. The empire hasn't fallen, but the shared sense of stability has quietly dissolved. And once that happens, everything else becomes a matter of timing. This is where collapse truly begins. Not in treasuries or armies, but in the collective psychology that quietly reshapes itself around diminishing trust. From here, the story always moves inward, into how people learn to live with uncertainty before they ever recognize its consequences. And that internal adjustment is where the deeper patterns start to emerge. Every functioning society runs on invisible agreements. People agree to follow rules they didn't write. They accept money that has no intrinsic value. They obey authorities they will never meet. They cooperate with strangers based on shared expectations. None of this works without trust. But trust is not permanent. It is renewed daily through consistency. When systems behave predictably, trust feels natural. When institutions respond fairly, trust feels earned. When leadership appears coherent, trust feels justified. But when these signals weaken, trust doesn't disappear overnight. It becomes conditional. People begin to hedge. They still participate in society, but they do so differently. They double-check claims. They question motives. They rely more on personal experience than official narratives. They stop assuming alignment between what is said and what is done. This shift is subtle. Outwardly, life continues. Markets open. Laws are enforced. Ceremonies proceed. But inwardly, people start to detach emotionally from structures they once believed in. They comply without conviction. They cooperate without confidence. This is one of the earliest psychological stages before collapse. Not rebellion. Withdrawal. Citizens don't immediately resist systems that disappoint them. Instead, they distance themselves. They lower expectations. They stop investing emotionally. They stop imagining long futures inside frameworks that feel increasingly fragile. They still show up, but they no longer believe in outcomes the same way. This is why collapsing societies often look calm from the outside. People are not panicking. They are adapting. They become pragmatic, transactional, short-term oriented. Relationships become more strategic. Planning horizons shrink. Conversations shift from growth to preservation, from opportunity to risk management. Trust becomes something people reserve for family, close friends, and familiar networks. Institutions become abstract, and once trust becomes selective, social cohesion begins to thin. Shared identity weakens. Collective responsibility fades. People start to feel that they are navigating complexity alone, even while surrounded by millions. The sense of common destiny dissolves quietly, replaced by private calculations. History shows that this phase can last a long time. Generations can grow up inside systems that feel hollow but functional. Children learn to read between the lines. Adults learn to operate within contradictions. Elders remember when things felt more solid, but struggle to explain what exactly has changed. Because it's not one thing. It's everything slightly. This is where denial takes root. Not dramatic denial, quiet denial. People acknowledge problems in conversation, but dismiss their significance internally. They treat structural issues as temporary disruptions. They assume correction is inevitable because imagining systemic failure feels too overwhelming. So they focus on routines. They go work. They care for families. They make plans. They celebrate milestones. They adapt. And through this adaptation, they unintentionally stabilize declining systems. Collapse doesn't advance against resistance. It advances through accommodation. Each adjustment keeps things running just enough to avoid confrontation. Each workaround extends the life of structures that no longer deserve confidence. Each compromise postpones reckoning, until eventually, the distance between appearance and reality grows too wide to ignore. And that's when people begin to sense that something deeper is unfolding. But by then, the psychological groundwork has already been laid, and the realization phase begins to take shape. Realization rarely arrives suddenly. It seeps in. At first, it appears as vague discomfort, a feeling that explanations are incomplete, that outcomes no longer match effort, that systems respond slowly, inconsistently, or not at all. People start noticing patterns, not in statistics, but in experience. They see that rules apply unevenly, that accountability feels selective, that decisions increasingly benefit distant structures rather than everyday lives. These observations accumulate quietly, forming a background sense of instability. Still, most people resist drawing large conclusions. They tell themselves that every society has problems, that turbulence is normal, that progress isn't linear. These reassurances are not dishonest. They are psychological defenses against confronting uncomfortable possibilities. Acknowledging systemic decline requires accepting uncertainty about the future, and human beings are wired to avoid that. So awareness develops slowly, through repetition. A delayed response becomes another delayed response. A broken promise becomes another broken promise. An exception becomes a pattern. Over time, these experiences reshape expectations. People stop being surprised. This is a critical transition. Surprise is a sign of remaining trust. When surprise fades, resignation begins. Once resignation takes hold, societies enter a new psychological phase. People stop asking when things will improve. They start asking how to navigate within limitations. They stop expecting restoration and begin optimizing survival. This is when collective behavior changes. Risk tolerance shifts. Cooperation becomes conditional. Moral standards soften under pressure. Long-term thinking gives way to immediate practicality. Communities fragment into smaller units of mutual support, not because people become worse, because they become realistic within environments that feel increasingly unstable. History shows that this stage often produces remarkable ingenuity. People find ways to adapt. They create parallel systems. They rely on informal networks. They develop new norms. These adaptations are impressive, but they also signal something important. They indicate that official systems are no longer trusted to fulfill their roles. This is where perception finally overtakes narrative. Leaders may still speak of continuity. Institutions may still project confidence. But people now interpret these signals differently. They hear reassurance as performance. They view stability as temporary. They assume that official optimism masks deeper problems. The emotional contract between society and authority quietly dissolves. Yet, even here, collapse does not feel dramatic. It feels administrative. Life becomes more complicated. Processes become slower. Outcomes become less predictable. People spend more energy navigating systems than benefiting from them. Complexity increases while reliability decreases. And this new normal becomes familiar. This is perhaps the most unsettling part of historical collapse. Not that things fall apart, but that people learn to live inside diminishing coherence. They adapt so thoroughly that even major deterioration feels incremental. Only in retrospect does the arc become visible. Only later do historians draw lines between early signals and eventual outcomes. For those living through it, each stage feels manageable, until suddenly it isn't, and by the time that threshold is crossed, perception has already shifted too far to return. Which brings us to the deeper mechanism behind every empire's decline. Not economic exhaustion, but psychological reorientation. At a certain point, systems stop feeling central to daily life. They become background noise. People still interact with institutions, but without emotional investment. Forms are filled out, procedures are followed, obligations are met, but the sense of shared purpose is gone. This detachment changes everything. When citizens no longer feel represented by systems, they stop defending them. When they no longer believe institutions protect them, they stop extending goodwill. When they no longer expect fairness, they stop behaving as if fairness is guaranteed. This is how moral frameworks begin to loosen, not through chaos, but through quiet recalibration. People adjust their ethics to match perceived reality. They become more flexible, more situational. What once felt unacceptable becomes understandable. What once felt wrong becomes necessary. These shifts are rarely conscious. They emerge from repeated exposure to inconsistency. If rules feel arbitrary, people stop respecting them. If enforcement feels selective, people stop internalizing standards. If outcomes feel disconnected from behavior, people stop striving for alignment. Trust is replaced by strategy. This is not cynicism. It is adaptation. Human beings are extraordinarily responsive to environmental feedback. When systems reward cooperation, cooperation flourishes. When systems reward opportunism, opportunism spreads. When systems feel unreliable, people learn to rely on themselves. Over time, this produces fragmented societies, not through conflict, but through divergence. Different groups develop different realities. Information becomes localized. Experiences vary widely. Shared narratives weaken. People stop assuming common understanding. Everyone is still living in the same civilization, but they are no longer living in the same story. This fragmentation accelerates decline because coordinated action requires shared belief. And shared belief cannot survive prolonged inconsistency. Empires depend on collective imagination as much as material resources. They require people to believe in continuity, to invest in futures they may never personally see, to accept present sacrifices for long-term stability. When that imagination fades, institutions become hollow shells. They continue operating, but without depth. Policies are enacted, but without legitimacy. Structures remain, but without loyalty. Authority persists, but without emotional backing. This is when collapse becomes inevitable, not because of any single failure, but because the social fabric that once absorbed shocks has quietly unraveled. From the outside, everything may still look intact. From the inside, people already feel disconnected. They plan differently. They prioritize differently. They speak differently. They move through life with cautious pragmatism instead of collective confidence. And yet, even here, there is rarely a sense of finality, just continuation, day after day, adjustment after adjustment, until eventually, what once felt abnormal becomes ordinary, and what once felt stable becomes distant memory, which leaves only one final stage to examine: the moment when people realize they've been living inside collapse all along. The recognition always arrives late, not because people are unaware, but because understanding emerges only after patterns become undeniable. At some point, individuals begin connecting experiences. They see continuity in disruption. They recognize repetition in failure. They realize that what felt like temporary turbulence has become structural reality. This realization is rarely dramatic. It feels like quiet clarity. People don't panic. They recalibrate. They accept that the world they trusted is no longer returning. They stop waiting for restoration. They adjust expectations downward. They focus on resilience instead of recovery. This is when history quietly turns, not through declarations, through acceptance. By the time societies collectively acknowledge decline, behavior has already changed. Networks have already shifted. Trust has already migrated. Adaptation has already occurred. The empire did not fall in that moment. It fell much earlier when perception changed. From that point forward, everything else was simply alignment, economic contraction, political instability, social fragmentation. These are consequences, not causes. They follow psychological transformation, not lead it. Empires don't collapse when resources run out. They collapse when shared belief dissolves. They collapse when people stop imagining a common future. They collapse when trust becomes conditional, when denial gives way to resignation, when adaptation replaces expectation. And they always collapse quietly first, long before visible breakdown, long before formal endings, long before anyone writes about it. The pattern repeats across civilizations, cultures, and centuries. Different languages, different symbols, same human responses. People normalize decline. They accommodate instability. They protect themselves. They withdraw emotionally from systems that no longer feel reliable. And only later do they recognize that these personal adjustments collectively reshape history. This is why collapse feels sudden in retrospect, because awareness trails reality, because perception always lags behavior, because societies do not fall from debt. They fall when the internal relationship between people and institutions fundamentally changes. By the time that change becomes visible, the trajectory is already set, not by leaders, not by policies, but by millions of quiet decisions made in response to eroding trust. And that is the enduring lesson of every fallen empire. Systems don't break all at once. People simply stop believing in them. And once it happens, the rest unfolds on its own, slowly, steadily, and almost imperceptibly, until history looks back and draws a line where no one living at the time ever saw one being drawn. And with that understanding, the cycle feels less mysterious and more profoundly human.